For our demo video, we're going to do these 4 steps. We're going to cut and remove the belly, we'll cut and remove the bloodline, we'll cut our saku blocks, and then we're going to remove the skin. Removing the skin last makes it a little bit easier. And depending on your comfort and skill level, you may decide to do some of these steps in a different order. And it's totally okay to do that. So let's get rolling. Your end goal is to cut saku blocks like this. Saku blocks are used for sashimi and nigiri. You'll also find that you'll have other parts of the fish left over, such as some strips, some pieces that are not as firm as saku blocks, and meat on skin. You can use these for poke, hand rolls, and other dishes. We're working with a 14-pound loin of ahi tuna. For most of you, you will end up working with one of these smaller chunks. And these smaller chunks are approximately 4 to 5 pounds. What Steve is pointing out there is the major and the minor lobe of the fish. This fish, you'll notice in a second, has a light pink area to it, and that is the belly. As Steve cuts through and creates this chunk, we'll see here that we have a lighter part of it on the bottom, the belly, and this darker color up top. And that darker color is really what you hear of as maguro. So we'll work with this larger chunk to demonstrate our 4 steps. The first step is to remove the belly. After that, we will shave off the bloodline. If your piece of tuna does not have a belly, you can skip this step. But please pay attention to the way Steve is cutting with his knife. When you cut with fish, you want to use long knife strokes. You want to avoid going back and forth in short and choppy strokes. Long strokes help keep the integrity of the fish and its consistency. If that belly is a little hard, then do exactly what Steve just did. Flip that fish around and just give it a couple of cuts on that side. So you notice in this belly, you have these white pieces, and that's like the sinew or the connective tissue. And what we can do with this piece of belly is we will cut across it, much like when you're thinking about cutting a piece of meat like a steak. You want to cut across the grain. And so similar concept here. So step 1 is now complete. We remove the belly. Next, what you'll want to do is remove this dark colored part of the fish called the bloodline. And the bloodline really is inedible. You'll be able to tell it from its really dark and rich color, as it carries a lot of nutrients and other things up and down the fish. The bloodline, you want to shave it off, and you may have to kind of curve your knife around a little bit, as you see Steve doing here, to get the bulk of it off. And don't worry, once you get the bulk of it off, you can go back and refine and continue to shave off little bits of bloodline. And again, we want to use as much of the fish as possible, so don't worry if you end up cutting a little bit of the flesh or the edible meat off. What you see Steve doing here is he's going to prepare to trim off that piece of meat, and we can use that in a hand roll. Also notice that Steve cleaned off his knife blade, and you'll notice these little white flecks, which are scales of the skin. We want to avoid having those in our fish as much as possible, as they're not fun to bite down into. So here Steve is trimming off more of the bloodline, and again, if he gets a little bit of flesh, what he'll do is he'll trim that off, and we can use that later for hand rolls and other dishes. Now that we've finished trimming off the bloodline, and again, you can always go back if you notice more, we want to start visualizing where our saku blocks will be. Now, for a lot of fish, you might be able to just do a vertical cut. Notice the skin side at the bottom and the top there. Now, what we noticed with this fish was that the top was a little bit softer, and we want your saku block to be a little bit firmer. So what we will do is we'll give our piece of fish a haircut to create a flat surface on top, and then we'll continue to cut our saku blocks in that same orientation. So here we are giving our piece of fish a haircut to create that flat surface on top. And what you'll find is that top piece of the fish, even though it's still relatively firm, maybe not as firm as where you want your saku block. This piece of fish you could use for poke, you could cut it into strips for hand roll, or if you really wanted to try it out, you could cut it for sashimi. Now that we've given our fish a haircut, we're cutting from top to bottom to create two large rectangles. And these two rectangles themselves will be cut in half to create our saku blocks. Notice again the long knife strokes, and the skin may take a little bit more to get through, but you notice the wonderful coloring of the fish, the pink at the bottom, the higher fat area, and that darker maguro color towards the top. We cut that larger rectangle in half, and we have the foundation of our saku block. You can trim off any side that needs it to make it a little more rectangular. And again, you can use that piece you've trimmed off for poke, for hand rolls, for other dishes. And there you have your saku block. And finally, our last task is to take off the skin. Once you've done that, you can clean up this saku block too. Steve's using a sashimi knife to do this, and his goal is to keep that knife blade as flat as possible, or on the same plane as the cutting board. You put a little pressure on top to help get it off, and then once you've done that, you've sliced through. And you'll see that on the piece of skin there's some meat left over, and that's okay because we can scrape that off with a spoon, and that's often used as the filling for a tuna roll or a spicy tuna roll. Once again, you're left with these wonderful saku blocks for sashimi or nigiri, or whatever you see fit. Thanks for watching our video on the basics of deconstructing ahi loins and cutting saku blocks. You can find more information at our website and our social media platforms. You can find information such as recipes or other ideas and techniques about how to cut fish and how to use fish. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. Thanks.